In this age of unprecedented division between right and left, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, traditionalists and progressives, there is one thing we all seem to have in common. One thing that unites us, one thing that everyone seems to agree on. And that is that America has gone to hell in a handbasket. Isn't it interesting, though, that we hear the same thing from both sides of the aisle? No matter how divided we are, we all seem to agree there's something seriously wrong in America today. We're united in this belief. One nation under degradation. One nation under condemnation. From the farthest reaching economic, political, and theological poles, we all seem to know where America has gone. We just can't seem to agree on why it went there or how to fix it. But at least we agree on something, right? Things were not that different in the first century. The Jewish community in Jesus' day was sharply divided. There were many different Jewish groups in Jesus' day, and they all had their own specific philosophies, their own specific answers to this problem. Matthew paints all of Jesus' opponents in a very disparaging light, which makes it difficult for us to sort them out. But it's important for us as modern interpreters to understand the differences between these various groups and the context of the disputes that they were engaged in. You had the scribes, the teachers of the law, the Essenes, the Zealots, the Sadducees, the chief priests, the authorities, the Sanhedrin, and of course, the Pharisees. All had their own distinct positions. It was a complicated and divisive time to be Jewish when Jesus came along and added something entirely new, which upset the entire menagerie. There's a scene that reflects this in Monty Python's The Life of Brian, one of my favorites. Brian is going around the Colosseum asking groups of religious leaders if they want something to eat. He comes up to one ominous-looking group and he says, "Are you the Judean People's Front?" And they respond, "Beg off, how dare you? We're the People's Front of Judea." Judean People's Front, come on. And Brian says, "Can I join your group? I hate the Romans." And they respond, "If you want to join the PFJ, you really, really have to hate the Romans." And Brian replies, "Well, look, I hate them a lot." And the leader of the PFJ says, "All right, you're in." Then he says, "Listen, Brian, the only people we hate more than the Romans are the Judean People's Front." "Yeah," another says, "and the Judean Popular People's Front." "Yeah," another says, "and the People's Front of Judea." "Wait a second," the leader says, "we're the People's Front of Judea." You can see how confusing things can get between religious groups. Because of the way that the author of Matthew portrays the Pharisees in an unfavorable light, they've become the paradigmatic enemies of Jesus, stereotyped as self-righteous and legalistic, overly focused on the letter and not the spirit of the law. Historically, the Pharisees have been the source of a lot of anti-Semitism, because the followers of Jesus in Matthew's day were dealing with a world where the temple had been destroyed already by the time of its writing. And the Pharisees and the followers of Jesus in Matthew's community were in a battle for control of the synagogue and the future of Judaism. However, the reality is we have to look back beyond Matthew to who the Pharisees really were. And they were a group that Jesus was the closest to philosophically, who he had the most in common with, which is why he engaged with them more than anybody else. Don't we end up arguing with those who have similar positions more than we do with those who are diametrically opposed to us? And that's what it was like for Jesus. Unlike the Sadducees and the scribes and the chief priests and the elders and the Pharisees, they're different. They were not agents conspiring with Roman occupation. The Pharisees, like the way, the church, were a reform movement within Judaism. They believed that the temple had become corrupt with greed and politics and corruption by the Roman Empire, collaboration with their oppressors. Jesus believed that as well. The Pharisees and the followers of Jesus both believed that Judea had gone to hell in a handbasket. But they could not agree on why it went there or how to fix it. According to the Pharisees, the reason Judaism had been corrupted and polluted was due to a lack of ritual purity. And the way to reform Judaism was to place a new emphasis on modes of purity practiced by individuals, largely in the context of their household. These purity observances worked from the outside in and were concerned with matters of physical and material practice, food and cooking utensils, clothing and hair, bodily functions, handling disease and corpses, Sabbath observance, and other matters of cleanliness and ritual purity. And this is why Jesus and the Pharisees found themselves in contentious debates about things that sometimes seem trivial to us in the first century, like washing your hands before eating or healing people on the Sabbath. In a world where most people don't go to church anymore, healing on the Sabbath seems pretty obvious. It's not that Jesus did not believe in ritual purity, or that he outright condemned the Pharisees' notion that these practices mattered. This is where we sometimes get confused. What Jesus did teach is that his followers should be focused on what he called the weightier matters of the law, which Jesus said later in Matthew 23 quite clearly are justice, mercy, and faith. Just like the first century, a hyper-focus on individual moral purity is what divides traditional evangelicals and progressives in America today. And not just any kind of individual moral purity, but specifically sexual purity. Have you ever noticed that all the primary issues evangelicals spend their energy on have to do with sex? Oh, it's occurred to you? Good, I'm glad. Abortion, homosexuality, the subordination of women, premarital sex, adultery. Even now, some are interested in sex trafficking. It's still about sex. This has led some scholars to proclaim that evangelicals are obsessed with sex. Anyone who grew up in the evangelical church like I did in the 80s and 90s, who was subjected to things like true love waits and the silver ring thing with promise rings and abstinence pledges, can tell you firsthand there has been an extreme fetishizing of sexual purity in the evangelical community. And I could spend an entire sermon talking about the physical and psychological harm that this movement has caused people. But I want to stop here to say, can you see how similar evangelicals' answers to the problems in America are to the Pharisees' answers to the problems in Judea? Individual morality, personal responsibility, things that happen in the household, purity, ritual, or sexual. If individuals were just purer and cleaner, then Judea and America would be saved from hell. And this is the moment in the sermon where you'd hear the evangelical preacher proof text 2 Chronicles. If my people who are called by my name would humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. I know you've heard that text before. It was the most searched for verse in 2020. The only problem is it has nothing to do with sex. My Uncle Mike has a joke about Puritans he likes to tell that comes from the journalist H.L. Mencken. It says this: Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, might be having a good time. The fear that someone, somewhere, might be happy or having a good time. Evangelicals have reduced the gospel to a rigid sexual ethic to avoid having to follow what Jesus actually said. And it's easy for us to cast dispersions on evangelicals for being prude or boring, grumpy, overly pious, or deeply repressed group of individuals. And while I believe that the intense focus on sexual purity has been a colossal distraction from the real problems that we face as a country, I must admit that when I give evangelicals the best reading I can, which is what we should always do with our opponents, what I see underneath all the rhetoric is that it's not really about sex. They're worried about something else, actually. The nuclear family. All their issues are about protecting what they believe is the bedrock of American society. The nuclear. They believe that there has been a breakdown in the nuclear family and that that's what's caused America to go to hell. The reason that they're hyper-focused on sexuality is they're convinced that the wrong kind of sex has broken the family and consequently sent America to hell in a handbasket. Purity is always about protecting something. Often, though, it's about protecting something that doesn't need protecting. Jesus, you may know from reading the Bible, doesn't believe in the nuclear family. It didn't even exist in the first century, so it would be hard to believe in something like that. And also Jesus said some very strange things about the family. Who are my mother and brothers? Those who do the will of God are my family. No one who said, I have come with a sword to set son against father and daughter against mother and to divide one's own household has traditional family values. How did the followers of a person who said, whoever loves father or mother more than me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take up cross and follow me is not worthy of me, become associated with protecting the family? It sounds like the opposite to me. Jesus didn't believe in the nuclear family and would not support any theology or church organized around the idea of protecting it. Jesus believed in something else, creating chosen family. Chosen family from among the poor and the outcast, the marginalized and the oppressed by society. For far too long, the American church has focused on the family instead of the weightier matters of the law. And we lost our moral witness. Now, we seem out of step. Even conservative writers like David Brooks are writing in the New York Times that the nuclear family was a mistake. Where is the church on this topic? We cannot forget, when we think about the concept of the nuclear family, that it was not built for women. It was not built for communities of color. It was not built for poor people or for people with disabilities or for LGBTQIA individuals. It was built for people who look like me, straight, white, heterosexual males, which means that protecting the nuclear family is first and foremost about protecting the power of patriarchy, which we know needs to be dismantled. And this doesn't mean that the family isn't important. I don't want you to misunderstand me. It just means it shouldn't be the focus of our faith. It's astonishing how little Jesus said about sex and the family versus how much evangelicals talk about it. They say so much about the things Jesus said so little, and so little about the things that Jesus talked about so much. Things like poverty, sickness, exclusion, oppression. It's become pretty clear now that our priorities are out of order, and we focused on things that Jesus was not focused on. Part of the reason attendance in church is declining and churches are closing and organized religion is floundering is because the world outside the church walls has seen our hypocrisy. They can see that we're not focused on the same things Jesus was. They can read the Bible too, and they can see it, and they don't want any part of it. And I'm not sure I can blame them. I was talking to a friend and mentor of mine recently, and she said, the church was an agent of colonist work in the world, an institution that used the Bible to justify a system for exploiting people, extracting resources, and taking their land. And she said this comment to me that really shook me. She said, and until those things are discussed and dealt with, I have no place in there. Until those things are discussed and dealt with, I have no place in there. It's harmful to me. She said, so until everybody's on board with decolonizing Christianity and serious about dealing with the long legacy of patriarchy, racism, homophobia, ableism, and ageism, repair the damage that these things have done to people and the planet, let alone the faith we possess, I have no place in there. The hard thing for me, though, is I know that this is a person who I believe we desperately need in the church. Which means it's not just evangelicals who need to reset their focus and their priorities. We progressive folk, we have a lot of work to do as well. I don't actually think the Pharisees lacked compassion for the poor. I think that's a misreading. I don't think they didn't care about people. I just believe they were like a lot of us. Simply got focused on the wrong things, superficial things. They got focused on the pursuit of purity, the protection of tradition, their personal preferences and pet peeves, their social tastes, their cultural norms. I'm not even sure it's fair to imagine that they were intentionally being indifferent, apathetic, or avoidant of the weightier matters of the law. I just think they got distracted, really distracted. Just like I don't think the average evangelical in America realizes that the hyper-focus on sex and the family is upholding a patriarchal institution that Jesus would have wanted to destroy. I don't think that crosses their mind. I think they're distracted. Look at this thing over here. Don't look at this. Right? Look at this thing, but not that thing. People will use a war, an earthquake, a heat wave, any massive event that they can to distract us from what's really going on, to take our attention somewhere else, to shift our focus. They'll try to hide the real problems we're facing behind a heavy news cycle, behind bad theology. When we're focused on ritual and moral purity like the Pharisees, we can be distracted from the real problems that are plaguing our community and blind to the suffering that people are experiencing every day right around us. In our stories from Matthew 12, Jesus wanted to feed people who were hungry and heal people who were sick, but the Pharisees challenged him because they could not shift their superficial focus on ritual purity to see the human beings who were suffering. Focusing all our attention on ritual or morality or sexual purity is not only opposite of what Jesus was focused on, it's not only a distraction from the problems of human suffering, it's also completely futile and pointless because there is no one who's pure. Nobody is pure. Purity is impossible. It's an abstraction, right? All of us miss the mark. Jesus said, no one is good but God alone. All of us fall short. All of us are complicit in systems of oppression. All of us are complicit in patriarchy. If purity is the goal, then what's the point of grace? If purity is the goal, then what's the good news? Jesus would not allow the Pharisees' hyper-focus on purity to prevent him from focusing on what was really going on in the first century. The Pharisees were focused on purity. Jesus was focused on people. You can look through every gospel and you'll find the same thing. Jesus was constantly aligning himself with the sick and the suffering and the sinners. Always spending time with people who were ostracized and oppressed. Never once did he demand ritual or moral purity before he healed someone or welcomed someone or liberated someone. As you've heard me say before, Jesus talked about money more than any other subject. But he also entered into the financial and economic reality of first century people and liberated folks from the ways that Roman imperialism and ritual purity were increasing their suffering. Healing meant that people could participate in community again. Healing meant they could go back to work. Healing meant they could go back to the farm. Healing meant they could provide for their families again. Jesus' ministry of healing was not just an act of compassion, but a political and economic activity as well. So was exorcising demons and feeding the hungry and forgiving people's sins. The Pharisees' focus on purity was a grand distraction from the harsh economic disparity of a first century world that was filled with huge disproportion and disparity between a small group of the socially and economically secure and the 90% who were chronically insecure. There was no middle class in the first century. It is estimated through scholars that tell us that a tiny group of the elite in the first century, about 2 to 3% of the population, controlled most of the land and consumed 65% of its production. They were then supported by a slightly larger group, 7 to 8% of what we call retainers: soldiers, merchants, priests, town or village elders, petty officials, and tax collectors. These were powerful agents of empire in a situation where the empire laid claim to all land, where all foodstuffs like crops and animals and fish, all the essentials of life, were heavily taxed. Together, these two groups, the elite and their retainers, exercised all the power in society, yet constituted only 10% of the population. Does it sound familiar? The remainder of the population, the socially disenfranchised, were field laborers, unskilled workers, beggars, and of course, fishermen, who the famous Roman lawyer Cicero ranked as the occupation with the lowest social standing in society: fishermen. Why would anybody who wanted to build a movement start by recruiting fishermen? It could only be because God sent him to the suffering people of the world. It could only be because God wanted to turn the way of the world upside down. It could only be because God had a preferential option for those on the bottom: the widows, the orphans, the foreigners, the fishermen. It could only be because the Spirit of the Lord had anointed Jesus to bring good news to the poor, as it says in Luke 4. It could only be because, as it says in our scripture today from Matthew 12, that the Spirit of the Lord had been put upon him to proclaim justice to the nations and hope to the Gentiles. You don't start a movement with fishermen if you're focused on purity. You start a movement with fishermen if you're focused on people and their real problems. The Pharisees of the first and the 21st century want us to focus on purity. They say it's a lack of sexual purity that has broken the family and taken America to hell in a handbasket. But there's something far more powerful that they don't want to talk about, far more powerful than sex, that has had a negative impact on the American family, and that's our economic system. If anything, that is what has led to a breakdown of the American family. You can track it historically. The advent and beginning of long hours at work, companies requiring employees to work on the evenings and on weekends, has made it impossible for families to spend quality time together that they need. They can either have family or they can starve. Which one would you choose? Just like the first century, we too have eliminated the middle class. Just pick up the Atlantic, you can read one of 20 articles about this. Low wages, horrible health care, skyrocketing housing costs, lack of affordable child care, the catastrophic defunding of public education, the erosion of every social welfare program, the privatization of all public goods. These are the forces that are hard on marriages. These are the forces that are hard on raising children. These are the forces bearing down on the American family. These are the forces causing people to bend and bruise and break. And you want us to talk about sex while people are sick. You want us to talk about sex while people are starving. You want us to talk about sex while people are sleeping outside. You really want us to talk about sex while people are suffering? No, thank you. No, thank you. Focusing on sex and the protection of the nuclear family is a grand distraction from the issues that are really killing us, destroying our families and our communities. For too long, American Christianity has been focused on these superficial symptoms, a vision of the family that does not work for all people. We need new eyes, new vision, new perspective, a new worldview, a new focus. We need to see the world with the eyes of Jesus, to focus on the things that Jesus was also focused on. The world wants us to focus on purity, but Jesus is focused on people. The world wants us to focus on symptoms, but Jesus is focused on the system. The world wants us to focus on sex. Jesus wants us to focus on suffering. The world wants us to focus on the superficial. Jesus wants us to focus on the serious and weightier matters of the law, like justice and mercy and faith. So the question for us, Myers Park Baptist Church, where will we put our focus? Where will we put our attention? Where will we put our energy? Where will we put our resources and our time? Everybody on all sides of the aisle agrees that America is going to hell in a handbasket. Nobody seems to think that the church has a role in helping to turn things around. But I do. They know that we're part of the reason things are the way that they are, but we can also be part of the solution if we want to be. Maybe, just maybe, if we could bring ourselves to focus on the things that Jesus focused on, then we could be that church that he talked about, the one he said he was building on a rock. That church, a church that is so laser focused on the weightier matters on the law, on justice, on mercy, and on faith, a church that Jesus said, even the gates of hell cannot prevail against it. Amen.